The dog found the boathouse at midnight. Cole Mercer didn't follow him at first. He sat on the warped porch of the lake house with his duffel bag still packed at his feet. The divorce papers folded inside his jacket pocket like a weight that had no business existing, and he watched Atlas disappear into the darkness along the shoreline. The German shepherd moved with that particular silence he reserved for serious things. Ears flat, nose dragging the ground, tail straight as a compass needle. Cole had seen that posture in 3 countries. It meant something was there. He told himself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon working the water's edge. He told himself a lot of things that first night. The lake sat perfectly still. The firs along the far bank were black against a sky still holding the last gray exhale of November, and the only sound was the water moving against the dock posts in that slow, patient rhythm that water always keeps, indifferent to whatever happens above it. Cole pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He had been awake for 31 hours. He had crossed 12 time zones. He had come home to a house with half the furniture missing and a manila envelope propped against the coffee maker where the coffee maker used to be. 12 years of marriage. 1 envelope. 2 signatures pending. Hers already done in blue ink. Atlas came back without whatever he'd been looking for. He sat directly in front of Cole, blocking his view of the lake, and put his enormous head in Cole's lap. Cole kept his hands pressed against his eyes. The dog waited. He was very good at waiting. "I know," Cole finally said. It was all he said. If this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world to this channel. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's on the other side of the screen. Cole Mercer had spent 14 years as a Navy SEAL, the last 6 of them as a chief petty officer running direct action missions in places the evening news never mentioned by name. He was 41 years old and built like a man who had never once in his adult life been allowed to be soft. His hands were calloused from things that had nothing to do with civilian life. There were 3 scars on his left forearm and a 4th on his neck just below the jaw, close enough to the artery that the corpsman who stitched it had gone unusually quiet. He slept light and ate fast and always sat with his back to a wall. These were not choices. They were the residue of a life lived in constant threat assessment. He had requested separation from the Navy 6 months before his enlistment was due to expire, which was something people in his position rarely did. His CO had looked at him across a metal desk in Virginia Beach and asked him, point blank, if there was something they needed to discuss. Cole said no. His CO knew better, but let it go. The Navy understood a certain kind of tired that didn't show up on any form. What the Navy hadn't known, and what Cole had barely admitted to himself, was that he had been coming home. Fully, deliberately, with intention. He had been thinking about the lake house in Oregon for 2 solid years. The one his father had left him, and the one where he and Diana had spent their first summer together. The one she had been managing in his absence while he was deployed. He had imagined arriving in October, when the maples along the road turned the color of fire. He had imagined walking through the front door to find the kitchen smelling like something on the stove, and Diana turning from the counter with that particular expression she got when she was trying not to look relieved. He had imagined it so many times that the reality of the envelope had required a moment of complete stillness just to understand. She had filed 3 weeks before his scheduled return. The lawyer's letter said the papers had been sent to the base. Cole had been in the field. He found them, along with 6 weeks of mail, in a bundle on his rack the morning he was packing out, and he had read the cover letter twice. Then he had packed his duffel. Then he had gotten in his truck at Virginia Beach and driven for 4 days because he could not bring himself to get on a plane. Atlas had been with him for all 4 days. The dog rode in the passenger seat with the window cracked regardless of temperature, his head half out into the rushing air. And in the motels, where Cole stopped for 4 and 5 hours at a stretch, he slept on the floor beside the bed, with one ear always up. Atlas was 8 years old. He had been a military working dog, explosive detection, patrol, handler protection, and had been retired from service 2 years ago when the handler he'd been partnered with for 4 years was killed in a vehicle accident outside of Kandahar. The Army had reached out through channels that Cole didn't entirely understand, and Atlas had arrived on a Tuesday morning at Cole's then apartment in Virginia Beach with a manila folder of veterinary records and a green canvas harness that still smelled faintly of the desert. Cole had not asked for a dog. He had also not said no. In the 2 years since, Atlas had become the clearest thinking in Cole's life. The dog did not manage him. He did not require careful handling or emotional maintenance. He simply existed at Cole's side with a quality of presence that Cole could only describe as honest. The dog saw what was actually there, not what anyone wanted to be there, and he responded accordingly. On the 4 nights they spent in motels between Virginia Beach and the Oregon Lake. When Cole woke from the particular kind of dream that left him sitting bolt upright with his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't on the nightstand, Atlas was always already there. Paw on the mattress, weight against the leg, breathing slow and deliberate, as if demonstrating the correct rhythm. They arrived at the lake house on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and the first thing Atlas did, before he had even finished drinking from the water bowl Cole set down in the kitchen, was walk straight through the house and out the back door and down the slope to the lake. Cole followed at a distance. He watched the dog move along the shoreline with that focused, purposeful stride, and he told himself again that it was nothing. Deer, raccoon, something in the water. The boathouse sat at the end of the dock, which extended 40 feet into the lake from a concrete pad that Cole's father had poured in the early 90s. The boathouse was old, weathered cedar planks gone silver with age, a tin roof that had rusted into a muted orange-red, a pair of sliding doors on the water side that Cole had never seen open in his adult life. His father had locked it sometime in the mid-90s, around the time Cole was 15, and had never explained why. Cole remembered asking. His father had said there was nothing in there worth getting into, and had said it in the particular way that meant the conversation was over, and Cole had left it alone, because that was what you did in the Mercer household. After his father died, Cole had inherited both the house and the property, and Diana had managed it as a short-term rental during his deployments. The boathouse had been listed on the rental property as a storage outbuilding, closed to guests. The padlock on the landside door was not the original one. It was a newer master lock, stiff in its shackle, the kind you bought when you needed something to hold and not be questioned. Cole had never thought much about when it had been replaced. He thought about it now because Atlas was sitting in front of that door with his nose pressed to the gap at the threshold, pulling air through the seal with the focused, deliberate intensity the dog used when he was telling Cole something specific. "What is it?" Cole said. It wasn't a question. Atlas didn't look up. He continued working the air at the base of the door, and then he sat back on his haunches and looked at Cole with those amber eyes that held a quality Cole could only describe as patient certainty. The dog's way of saying he had found what he had found, and he would wait however long it took for Cole to catch up. Cole crouched and pressed his own face toward the gap. The smell that came through was complex. Old wood, standing water, something metallic and faintly sweet beneath it. He had smelled enough of the world's closed spaces to know that smell meant time. Sealed time. Something in there had been sealed away from air and light for years, possibly decades. And whatever it was generating that particular odor of old preservation. He stood and looked at the padlock. The keyhole was clean, no rust in it, which meant someone had been using oil on it recently. The lock had been maintained. He filed that away the way he filed everything, quietly, without reaction, in the part of his mind that was always running inventory. That night he didn't sleep. He lay on the bare mattress in the bedroom, where Diana had apparently removed even the fitted sheet, and he stared at the ceiling, and Atlas lay on the floor beside him, with his chin on his front paws, and outside the lake made its slow, quiet sound against the dock. Cole thought about the envelope in his jacket pocket. He thought about the padlock with its oiled keyhole. He thought about his father standing at the dock's edge in the summer of 1994, when Cole was 16, staring out at the boathouse with an expression Cole had never been able to read and had mostly stopped trying to understand. He thought about the fact that Diana had been managing this property for 6 years and had never once mentioned the boathouse, not in letters, not in calls, not in the handful of video chats they'd managed over the years, most of them brief and disjointed by latency and the particular awkwardness that grew between two people who were building separate lives in the same direction and calling it a marriage. He had a lot to think about, and not enough solid ground to think on, and by 3 a.m, Atlas was up and pacing, which meant Cole should be up and moving too, and he swung his legs off the mattress and laced his boots in the dark, and they went back down to the lake. The night was cold enough to see breath. The dock boards were slick with frost. Atlas led him straight back to the boathouse door and resumed his position at the threshold, and Cole stood behind him with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the padlock and thought about what it meant to be standing in front of a locked door on a piece of property that was half his name and half a stranger's signature, in the dark, in November, with nothing he'd planned for still intact. He did not break the lock that night. He was not ready to know yet what was on the other side. The town of Garrison, Oregon, sat at the north end of the lake, where the highway curved in from the mountains before dropping into the valley. It had a diner, a hardware store, a marina, a school, and approximately 800 people who all knew each other's business and a portion of each other's history. Cole had grown up partly here and partly elsewhere, which meant he was known without being fully claimed. People remembered his father. People remembered him as the Mercer kid who went into the military and never quite came back. People who had known Diana from the rental seasons, the weekends she had hosted, the town events she had attended with the easy warmth she had always carried in public, looked at Cole when he appeared at the hardware store on his second morning with a particular expression that he recognized without being able to name. He bought bolts and lumber and a new set of clamps. He didn't explain what for. The woman behind the counter, he remembered her name was Carol. She had been behind that counter since before Cole left for the Navy. Rang him up without meeting his eyes, which told him everything Diana had told the town before she left. He loaded the truck without hurrying and drove back to the lake house and spent the afternoon reinforcing the dock boards that had gone soft from seasons of neglect. Atlas walked the dock perimeter while he worked, pausing every circuit at the boathouse doors to check whatever he had been checking since the night before. Cole let him check. He nailed boards and didn't think too hard about anything. A man named Roy Haskell came by in the late afternoon. Roy owned the property on the north side of the Mercer line, a working waterfront lot with a boat shed and a small commercial fishing operation, and had been Cole's father's closest neighbor for 30 years. He was 72 and built like someone had compressed a larger man into a smaller frame. And he stood at the top of the dock with his hands in his vest pockets and watched Cole work for a moment before he spoke. "Heard you were back," Roy said. "Word travels." "Always has up here." Roy looked at the lake. "Diana's gone then." Cole set down his hammer. "Looks that way." "She left about 6 weeks ago. Came and packed 2 trucks." He paused. "Seemed like she'd been planning it." Cole said nothing to that. Roy looked at the boathouse. Then he looked at Cole. "You thinking about opening that up?" Something in the way he asked it made Cole look at him directly for the first time. Roy's expression was careful, not unfriendly, but careful in the way of a man who knows more than he intends to say, and has not yet decided whether to say any of it. "Should I be?" Cole asked. Roy scratched the back of his neck. When he looked at the boathouse again, he looked at Atlas, who had come to stand beside Cole and was watching Roy with the polite, attentive gaze he used when he was taking a measure of someone. "Your father put a lot into that place," Roy said finally. "Lot of time. More than folks knew." He paused again. "I always figured he expected you to find it eventually." Cole waited. Roy put his hat back on, which was apparently all he intended to say. "You need anything?" "I'm around." He turned and walked back up the slope toward his property line and didn't look back. Cole stood on the dock after he left and looked at the boathouse and felt the particular pressure of a thing that has been waiting a long time to be found. He slept that night in 3-hour intervals. Between them, Atlas patrolled the dock, the shore, and the perimeter of the house, and came back each time to press his forehead against Cole's knee and breathe in that slow, deliberate way, as if returning the rhythm. In the early morning, just before dawn, Cole lay on his back on the bare mattress and stared at the ceiling and allowed himself to think about Roy's face when he said, "Your father put a lot into that place." He allowed himself to think about the oil in the padlock's keyhole. He allowed himself to think about the fact that Diana had managed this property for 6 years and had filed for divorce exactly 3 weeks before he was scheduled to come home. Not after, not during, but specifically before, as if she had been waiting for a particular window and had used it. He was not yet ready to say what any of that added up to. He had been a SEAL for 14 years, and one of the things you learned in that life was that the first interpretation of any situation was almost always incomplete. You gathered information, you waited for pattern, you did not commit to a conclusion until the evidence forced you. Atlas came in from his last circuit and lay down at the foot of the mattress. Cole put his hand on the dog's side and felt the steady rise and fall. And outside, the lake was beginning to catch the first gray light of morning, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the inventory kept running. In the morning, he drove to town for coffee and found that 2 people he didn't know were discussing him in the diner, with their voices lowered in the way that people in small towns have always used when they want to be heard while appearing not to be. He caught the words before he sat down at the counter. Something about the boathouse, something about Diana, something with a particular inflection that told him the local version of his situation had already been composed and distributed. He drank his coffee at the counter and did not respond to any of it. Carroll refilled his cup without being asked, which he took as a small gesture of grace, and he left a larger tip than the coffee warranted and drove back to the lake. Atlas was waiting at the truck's passenger door when Cole came out of the diner. The dog had been in the back seat, but had apparently decided the back seat was not where he needed to be. Cole let him in, and they drove back along the lake road, with the firs pressing in on both sides and the water visible in silver flashes between the trees. And Atlas had his nose at the gap of the window, reading whatever the morning air was carrying. At the house, Cole got a pry bar from the shed. He stood in front of the boathouse's landside door for a moment. The padlock hung on its hasp. It was a good lock, not the kind you attacked directly. He looked at the hasp instead. 4 screws, the heads painted over with something that had dried and flaked away at the edges, the wood beneath it soft from years of moisture. He worked the pry bar into the gap and leaned into it, and the hasp came away from the door frame with a sound, like a slow exhale. The padlock dropped free, still locked around nothing. He pulled the door open. The smell hit him first. Old wood. Water. Something layered beneath that he couldn't immediately identify. Cold air moved out past him, and the particular cold of a sealed space releasing its breath. Atlas pushed in ahead of him without being asked, and stood inside the boathouse, with his head up and his nose working, scanning the space the way he had been trained to scan rooms for trace. Cole waited in the doorway for his eyes to adjust. Light came through gaps in the siding and through the 2 small windows on the lakeside. Gray, diffuse, enough to see by. The boathouse was larger inside than he had expected. The wooden cradle in the center, designed to hold a boat on land, was empty. That wasn't the surprise. What stopped him was what was around and behind the cradle. Shelving, built careful and deliberate against 3 of the 4 walls, and on the shelving, in careful stacks, boxes. File boxes. Dozens of them. Old green military issue and newer civilian ones, and their sides labeled in handwriting that Cole recognized immediately. His father's handwriting. Atlas circled the room once and came back to Cole's side and sat. He was not alerting to anything dangerous. He was simply present, watchful, settled, aware that something important had been found. Cole stood in the doorway of the sealed boathouse his father had locked in 1994, staring at 30 years of carefully preserved boxes in his father's handwriting. And he understood for the first time that he had not come home to a divorce. He had come home to something much older than that. He stepped inside. The first box he touched was labeled in his father's careful block letters. Cole, do not open until you are ready. He set it down on the boat cradle. Atlas pressed against his leg. Outside, the lake made its slow sound against the dock pilings, and he was not ready. Not yet. But he was beginning to understand that ready was not a condition you waited for. It was a condition you built toward, one board at a time, one lock removed at a time, one cold morning at a time with a German shepherd leading the way. He closed the boathouse door behind him and walked back up the slope to the house, and Atlas walked beside him, and the lake glittered in the morning light, like it had been doing for a very long time without anyone paying attention. The neighbors started talking about the boathouse within 3 days. Cole did not do much to stop it. He came and went from the hardware store and the lumber yard and the marina supply, and he bought things that people could see, weather stripping, LED lanterns, marine plywood, on an electric dehumidifier, and he drove back to the lake house and carried them down to the boathouse, and people who drove the lake road could see the light on inside late into the evenings. In Garrison, that was sufficient for a story. Roy Haskell came by on the fourth day and stood at the dock's edge and watched Cole running weather strip along the inside of the doorframe. "People are saying you're restoring it," Roy said. "I am. Some folks are saying other things." Cole kept his hands moving along the frame. "What kind of other things?" "That you're not well. That coming back to an empty house scrambled something in you." Roy paused. "Diana apparently said some things before she left, about your state of mind." Cole finished the strip he was working on, pressed it flat with his thumb, and turned. "Diana left 3 weeks before I got home. I know that. She didn't know my state of mind when I got home. She didn't see it." Roy looked at the lake. "No," he said. "She didn't." They stood in silence for a moment. Atlas came out of the boathouse and sat beside Cole, and Roy looked at the dog with an expression that was somewhere between respect and relief. "That dog of yours," Roy said. "He found it first?" "He found it the first night." Roy nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted, not quite to relief, but in that direction. Like a man who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and can feel the weight redistributing. "Your father was a good man," Roy said. "He just didn't know how to say certain things out loud." Cole looked at him. "You knew?" Roy did not answer that directly. He put his hat on and turned back toward his property line and said over his shoulder, "Don't rush it. He built it careful. Whatever's in there waited 30 years. It can wait until you're ready." He walked away up the slope, and Cole watched him go and said nothing. And Atlas watched Roy too, and neither of them moved until the old man disappeared into the tree line between the properties. Inside the boathouse, in the improving light of a string of LED lanterns Cole had hung from the ceiling joists, the boxes waited. Cole began with the perimeter, not the boxes, not yet. He repaired the siding gaps to stop the moisture intrusion. He replaced 2 rotted floor joists. He serviced the ancient bilge pump and got it running again, lowering the standing water that had pooled in the boat slip over years of abandonment. So he installed the dehumidifier on a timer. He sealed the windows with new gaskets and cleaned the glass and let the weak November light come in without compromise. He did all of this over the course of 5 days without opening a single box. Atlas was with him for every hour of it. The dog moved through the space without alarm, settling in various corners to watch while Cole worked, occasionally standing and sniffing at a particular shelf, as if cross-referencing something he had already cataloged. Cole let him check. The dog wasn't wrong about things. On the 6th day, with the boathouse sealed and dry and properly lit, Cole sat on the boat cradle in the center of the room and picked up the box labeled Cole. "Do not open until you are ready." He set it in his lap. Atlas came and sat directly in front of him, and the way he had sat in the hotel rooms on the drive across the country. The way he sat whenever Cole's breathing needed steadying. The dog's amber eyes held that quality of patient certainty that Cole had come to understand was not an animal emotion. It was something deeper than emotion. Something that functioned more like a kind of knowledge that did not require words. Cole opened the box. Inside, packed in archival sleeves and stacked in careful chronological order, were letters. Hundreds of letters. All of them addressed to Cole. All of them in his father's handwriting. all of them unopened, not because Cole had received them and chosen not to open them, but because they had never been sent. He lifted the first one from the top of the stack. The date on the envelope was the summer of 1994. Cole had been 16. He turned it over in his hands. The envelope was sealed, addressed in his father's careful block print to C. Mercer, with no return address, as if his father hadn't known where he would be when Cole eventually found them. The return address that wasn't there would have been this Boathouse. Cole understood that now. His father had been writing to him from here, in the space he had sealed against the world, for years. Outside, through the cleaned windows, the lake caught the afternoon light and held it the way lakes hold light, perfectly, without effort, without trying to be beautiful. Cole set the first letter down. He picked up the second. He checked the date. He began to understand the sequence. And in understanding the sequence, he began to understand that whatever he thought he knew about his father and this property and the years that had passed between them, he was going to have to reconsider entirely. Atlas rested his chin on Cole's knee. Cole put one hand on the dog's head. He did not read the letters yet. He sat with them in the improving warmth of the sealed and repaired boathouse, with the dehumidifier running its quiet cycle and the lake outside doing what lakes do. And he understood for the first time since he had arrived that this was the thing the sealed door had been holding. Not a secret against him. A secret for him. He looked at the dog. "Good work," he said quietly. Atlas blinked once, slow and certain. Outside, through the window, a car slowed on the lake road. Cole did not move. The car stopped for a moment. He could hear the engine idling, and then it continued on. More eyes for the local story. More material for the version of events that did not include what was actually in this room. Let them look. Let them talk. They were seeing the outside of something, the outside of which was all they were going to get. Cole Mercer sat in his father's sealed boathouse with 30 years of unsent letters in his lap, and a German shepherd keeping watch at his knee, and the inventory that had been running in the back of his mind since the night of his arrival began, at last, to find its pattern. He was not ready, but he was close. And close, he had learned a long time ago, was where everything important began. He read through the night. He had not planned to. He had told himself he would open 2 or 3 letters, get a sense of the shape of the thing, and then sleep, because he had not slept properly since Virginia Beach, and his body was beginning to register the debt. But the first letter undid that plan completely, and the second confirmed it. And by the time he was 6, letters deep, he understood he was not going to stop until the lake went dark and came back light again. Atlas lay on the boat cradle beside him, pressed against his thigh, and the string of LED lanterns cast their steady white light across his father's handwriting, and Cole Mercer read 30 years of a man's undelivered truth. The first letter was dated July 12th, 1994. Cole had been 16. His father wrote in the careful block print he used for everything. Shopping lists, equipment labels, the name on a mailbox. The handwriting was the same as the handwriting on the outside of the envelope, which was the handwriting Cole had been reading his whole life without ever seeing what it was carrying. The letter began, "Cole, by the time you read this, I will have either found a way to tell you this in person, or I won't have. I'm not betting on myself to say it out loud. So here it is on paper, where words stay still long enough to mean something." Cole stopped after the first paragraph and looked at the ceiling of the boathouse. Then he looked at Atlas, who had one eye open and the other closed, monitoring him in that half-vigilant way the dog had during the quiet hours, when full alertness wasn't needed, but the threat of attention was never completely dropped. He kept reading. His father had not been a man who talked. That was the simplest and most complete description Cole had for him. A man who moved through the world in near silence, who expressed affection through maintenance, who showed up to every school event and athletic competition, and stood at the back with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands, and never once said the specific things that a son waits his whole life to hear. Cole had joined the Navy at 18, partly because of the structure and partly because of the distance, and for a long time he had told himself the distance was what had kept his relationship with his father from becoming something worse than silence. They had been polite. They had been functional. They had fished together on summers when Cole was home and spoken about weather and property maintenance and the condition of the dock. And they had not spoken about the things that mattered. And then Cole's father had died of a heart attack on a March morning in 2017, while Cole was in the Pacific, and Cole had made it back for the funeral, but not for anything before it. In the letters, his father talked. He talked the way the living cannot seem to manage, without self-protection, without the social architecture that turns feeling into performance. He talked about Cole's mother, who had died when Cole was 4, and about how the grief of it had gone underground in him, the way water goes underground, invisible on the surface, but shaping everything beneath. He talked about watching Cole grow up with a reserve that he recognized as his own inheritance, and about knowing he was passing it forward and not knowing how to stop. He talked about the lake and the property with a precision and tenderness that surprised Cole, as if the land itself were a person the father had been in relationship with, a relationship he had maintained when all his others had failed him. And then, in the 5th letter, dated June of 1998, when Cole was 20 and already 2 years into his Navy enlistment, his father wrote about the property in a different way. Cole, I need you to know something about this land that I should have told you before you left. I'm telling you now, in this letter, you may not read for years, because I'm not sure how much time I have to sort it out, and I need you to know it exists regardless of whether I finish the sorting. The property, all 640 acres of it, from the highway down to the lakefront and across the South Ridge to the county line, was surveyed in 1947 when your grandfather filed the original deed. The survey included the lake access and the full frontage. What it also included, though no one paid attention to it at the time because it wasn't worth paying attention to, was a water rights claim that runs with the deed. Every acre of this property, under Oregon water law, carries the right to the lake access and to the groundwater beneath. Your grandfather filed it because the lawyer told him to. He didn't know what it was worth. I didn't know what it was worth until 1993, when a man named Gerald Ashworth came to the door. Cole set the letter down. He looked at Atlas. The dog had both eyes open now, watching him the way Atlas watched when Cole's physiological state changed in a way the dog registered before Cole did. The elevated pulse, the shift in breathing, the particular quality of stillness that was not relaxation. I'm all right, Cole said. He picked the letter back up. Gerald Ashworth had come to the door in the fall of 1993, representing a land development group called Meridian Pacific Properties, and he had made Cole's father an offer to purchase the lake frontage and the Boathouse parcel, not the house, not the acreage, just the waterfront strip, including the water rights that ran with it. He had offered a number that Cole's father, by his own account, had been too surprised to process correctly in the moment. So Cole's father wrote. He named a figure that would have been more than I'd earned in the previous 15 years combined, and he said it the way you say something you expect to be accepted, like it was already done, and we were just going through the form of it. Cole's father had told him he needed time to think. Ashworth had left a business card. Cole's father had spent the next 6 months finding out what the card meant. What it meant was this. Meridian Pacific Properties had been quietly acquiring lake frontage throughout the county for the better part of a decade, not because they planned to develop it, or not only because they planned to develop it, but because the water rights attached to the frontage were worth considerably more than the land itself. On Oregon's prior appropriation doctrine meant that whoever held the oldest water rights claim to a given watershed had senior priority during drought conditions, which were becoming less theoretical and more operational with each decade. Meridian Pacific was building a portfolio of water rights, and the Mercer parcel, with its 1947 filing date, was one of the oldest claims on the lake. Cole's father wrote, I turned Ashworth down. I turned down every offer that came after, and there were 4 more over the next 8 years, from 3 different companies with different names that all turned out to be Meridian, or Meridian's money in different clothes. When I stopped answering the door, they started sending letters. When I stopped responding to letters, they found other approaches, which I won't go into in detail here because I don't want to put anything on paper that I can't prove. What I will say is this. Pay attention to who approaches you after I'm gone. Pay attention to who already knows things about this property that they shouldn't know unless someone has been talking. If this story has you hooked, and I think it has, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is told with everything I've got, and your support is the reason I keep making them. Thank you for being here. Cole read the rest of the 5th letter and moved to the 6th, and the 6th opened a door that the 5th had been standing in front of. His father had been keeping records, not just letters. Behind the shelving that lined 3 walls of the boathouse, underneath the false backs that Cole had not yet discovered and would not discover until the following morning when Atlas began pawing at a particular section of shelving with a systematic, deliberate insistence. There were files, legal files, survey documents, chain of title going back to 1947, correspondence, copies of letters received and sent, notes from conversations with attorneys, water rights filings, and responses to challenges. A complete and meticulous legal history of every attempt Meridian Pacific and its affiliated entities had made to acquire, challenge, or undermine the Mercer water rights claim over a period of nearly 30 years. And, in a sealed envelope at the back of the deepest file box, notarized and witnessed, on a document that Cole's father had prepared with the help of a water rights attorney in Portland sometime in 2015, 2 years before his death. A document that conveyed his legal strategy for the claim's protection, including the specific steps his heir would need to take to enforce it against any challenge, and the name of the attorney in Portland, who held the corresponding copy and had been waiting for someone with the name Cole Mercer to walk through her door. Atlas found the false back in the shelving the next morning. Cole had been working methodically through the boxes, reading his father's accounts of the legal battles and building a picture in his mind of the terrain, the way he would have built a picture of any complex hostile environment, before committing to movement through it. He was beginning to understand the shape of what his father had been doing, and the shape was both larger and more deliberate than he had expected. His father had been preparing a case, quietly, without an audience, over 30 years, in a sealed room that no one knew about. Atlas had been patient through the morning hours, checking the shelves at intervals, in the way he checked things he hadn't fully resolved. On the third circuit, he stopped at the south wall shelf, a unit of heavy pine that Cole's father had built against the studs, and began pawing at the lower right section with a focused, rhythmic insistence that Cole had learned to never ignore. Cole came and crouched beside him. He ran his hands along the back panel of the shelf. It felt solid. He pressed in different places. In the lower right corner, where Atlas kept returning his paw, the panel flexed inward a quarter of an inch. Cole took his pry bar and worked it into the joint. The panel came away cleanly, hinged at the bottom on a piano hinge, swinging down and out to reveal a cavity in the wall behind. Inside the cavity, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas, were the files. Cole crouched in front of that opening for a long time. Then he reached in and began taking them out, one at a time, setting each one on the boat cradle behind him. Atlas sat and watched the stack grow. By the time the cavity was empty, the stack was nearly 2 feet tall. Cole sat on the concrete floor of the boathouse with his back against the wall and began to read. He was in there for most of that day. He came out twice, once to get water, once to walk the dock with Atlas, who needed the movement and whose needs Cole treated with the same priority he would have treated a teammate's. The air outside was sharp and clean, and the lake was flat, under a sky that had gone from gray to a thin, pale blue. And Cole stood on the dock and looked at the water and breathed and said nothing. Then they went back in. By late afternoon, he had a working picture of what the files contained, and the picture was this. His father had built a complete legal case for the water rights claim. He had documented every approach Meridian Pacific had made, with dates and names and the dollar amounts of each offer, figures that had grown considerably over the years, from the original sum in 1993 to a number in 2014 that made Cole's jaw tighten when he read it. He had hired the Portland attorney, a woman named Catherine Brandt, to review and structure the case. He had filed preemptive legal actions to establish the claim's validity in a county court record, so that any challenge would have to contend with an existing judgment. He had, in other words, done everything that a man who could not bring himself to have a direct conversation with his only son could do to protect that son's inheritance across time. And on a yellow legal pad tucked inside the back cover of the last file folder, in his father's block print, were 3 words. Find Kate Brandt. Atlas put his chin on Cole's knee. Cole kept his hand on the dog's neck. He did not fully trust what he was feeling in that moment. There was too much of it, too compressed, layered over 14 years of deployment and silence, and the particular grief of a relationship that had ended before it could become what it should have been. He was not going to mistake the weight of that for something manageable, but he understood now what had been locked in the boathouse, and he understood, with a cold and specific clarity that replaced the vague unease he had been carrying since the night he arrived, what else the boathouse's existence implied. Diana had managed this property for 6 years. She had hosted guests, corresponded with the county assessor about the rental operation, maintained the exterior of the house. She had listed the boathouse as a closed outbuilding, not available to guests. She had, according to Roy Haskell, packed 2 full trucks, and left 6 weeks before Cole was scheduled to return. She had filed for divorce 3 weeks before his arrival, which meant she had hired a lawyer at least 6 weeks before that, which meant the decision to leave had been made no later than August, late summer, the end of the rental season, the last point at which she would have had access to the property without Cole present. Cole thought about the padlock, the newer master lock, maintained with oil, not the original hardware his father had used. He thought about Roy Haskell's face when he'd asked, "You thinking about opening that up?" He thought about, "Pay attention to who already knows things about this property that they shouldn't know unless someone has been talking." He sat with these thoughts in the orderly way he had learned to sit with intelligence that had to be verified before it could be acted on. He was not going to make accusations he couldn't support, but the inventory that had been running since the first night was now producing a pattern, and the pattern was becoming difficult to read as coincidence. Cole put the files back in the cavity, replaced the panel, and walked up to the house to find his phone. He had 12 calls and 26 text messages, most of them from numbers he didn't recognize. He scrolled past all of them until he found the number he was looking for, his former JAG contact from his time in Virginia Beach, a man named Marcus Webb, who had helped Cole navigate an administrative matter 4 years ago, and who owed Cole a favor of a specific and professional nature. Cole called. Marcus picked up on the second ring. Cole said, "I need to know everything you can find about a company called Meridian Pacific Properties and their current legal status in Tillamook and Lincoln counties in Oregon." Marcus said, "That's specific." Cole said, "It gets more specific. I also need to know if a woman named Diana Mercer, formerly Diana Carr, has had any recent interaction with that entity or its subsidiaries, legal, financial, or otherwise." There was a pause. Marcus said, "Cole, what's going on?" Cole looked out the kitchen window at the lake. Atlas was already down at the dock, patrolling its perimeter in the way he patrolled everything he had decided was his responsibility to monitor. "My father left me something," Cole said. "Someone knew about it before I did. He told Marcus enough to give him direction, and not enough to slow him down with questions. So when Marcus said he would make some calls and get back to him within 48 hours, and Cole ended the call and went back down to the dock to walk with Atlas and let the morning settle, Roy Haskell found him there. The old man came down his side of the property line and stood at the fence and looked at Cole with the expression of a man who has reached a threshold he has been approaching for a long time. "You found the files," Roy said. It was not a question. Cole looked at him. "How long have you known about them?" Roy looked at his hands. "Your father told me, the winter before he died. He was worried he'd run out of time before you came back. He asked me to watch the Boathouse." He paused. "I watched it best I could. But Diana had the property access and I wasn't." He stopped. He tried again. "I wasn't sure of her, but I didn't have anything solid." Cole waited. Roy said, "A man came around last spring, 3 months before Diana left, parked his car on the road for 2 days running, and walked to the lake side of the property with a surveying tool. I took photographs. I have them if you want them." Cole looked at the old man for a long moment. "Why didn't you call me?" Roy met his eyes. "I didn't know how. You were overseas. I had photographs of a man with a tool I couldn't name, and a woman who had every legal right to be on the property, and a locked boathouse your father told me to protect. I didn't know what I was dealing with." He paused again. "I'm sorry. I should have found a way." Cole thought about 14 years of messages that should have been sent and were not, and decided not to hold that particular failure against Roy Haskell. "Send me the photographs," he said. The town did not improve its opinion of Cole during this period. If anything, it consolidated around a narrative that was easier to maintain than the truth. The veteran had come home unstable, had fixated on an old outbuilding, was spending his days alone in it, with a military dog, and no apparent plan for anything constructive. People said this with the comfortable certainty of those who have never needed to be right, only consistent. At the diner, at the marina, at the hardware store where Carol watched Cole come and go without comment, the version of events that required the least explanation was doing its work. A woman named Patricia Lund, who ran the county planning office and whose cousin had sold a lakefront parcel to what turned out to be a Meridian Pacific subsidiary in 2018, stopped Cole in the parking lot of the hardware store on a Thursday morning and told him with genuine seeming concern that she had heard he was spending a lot of time in that boathouse, and that if he was thinking about any modifications to a structure on the waterfront, there were permitting requirements he should be aware of. She said it with the careful language of someone who wanted to gather information while appearing to dispense it. Cole thanked her for the information and loaded his truck and left. He called Marcus that night. Marcus had been thorough. Meridian Pacific Properties had 3 active legal filings in 2 adjacent counties, all related to water rights consolidation challenges. One of the filings, case number and docket date supplied, had been submitted to the county clerk 8 months ago, contesting the validity of a water rights claim attached to a parcel in the Lake District. The parcel description matched the Mercer property. The filing had been submitted by an attorney named Douglas Cale, representing Meridian Pacific. The attorney who had submitted the filing on behalf of Meridian Pacific was, according to the docketing records, the same firm that had processed Diana Mercer's divorce filing. Cole sat with that for a very long time. Atlas came and sat in front of him in the kitchen chair and put both paws on Cole's knees, which was not something the dog did casually. It was a weight-bearing gesture, deliberate and specific, used in the field when Cole's system needed grounding before he made a decision he couldn't unmake. Cole put his hands on Atlas's sides and breathed, and the dog breathed back at him, as steady and even, and outside the lake made its indifferent sound. He did not spiral. He did not arrive at conclusions he couldn't support. He stayed inside what he knew. The same law firm had filed against the Mercer water rights claim and processed the divorce of Diana Mercer. That was a fact. What it meant required one more step. He called the number on the yellow legal pad. Catherine Brandt, attorney at law, Portland. She picked up on the 3rd ring, and when Cole said his name, there was a pause that told him she had been waiting for that name and had not been certain it would ever call. "Your father told me you'd come eventually," she said. "He just didn't know when." Cole said, "Tell me what I'm dealing with." She told him. It took 40 minutes. When she was done, Cole had a complete picture for the first time since the night he had arrived, and the picture was this. Meridian Pacific had been building a case to challenge the Mercer water rights claim for years, knowing that the claim, if properly enforced, was worth significantly more than any realistic offer the company had made or could make. The strategy was not to purchase the rights, but to invalidate them. To argue in court that the 1947 filing was defective, that the chain of title had been broken by a period of non-use or improper transfer, and that the rights had therefore lapsed and were available for new appropriation. Cole's father had anticipated this strategy and had built his preemptive filing specifically to block it. The filing was solid. Catherine Brandt believed it would hold. But the preemptive filing required an active owner to maintain it. And if the property changed hands, if, for example, a divorce settlement transferred controlling interest to a party who was willing to accept a settlement with Meridian Pacific, the filing's maintenance would be compromised. The new owner would not have the standing Cole's father had established, and Meridian's challenge could potentially succeed in the vacuum. Cole said, "Diana." Brandt said, "The divorce filing put the property in dispute status. Under Oregon law, disputed property can't be encumbered or transferred during active divorce proceedings without court approval. But Meridian's concurrent filing in the water rights case creates a parallel track where they can argue that the property rights have already been constructively abandoned because the current owner, you, can't legally act on the claim while divorce proceedings are active." Cole said, "They filed both cases at the same time." Brandt said, "Within 10 days of each other." Atlas had come to lie across Cole's feet while he listened, his weight grounding and specific, and Cole sat in the kitchen of a house that was half his and half a legal dispute, and understood for the first time the full architecture of what had been built around him. His father had built a fortress. Someone had been waiting for the fortress to be unoccupied. "What do I need to do?" Cole said. Brandt said, "Come to Portland. Bring everything you found. Now we file a response to Meridian's challenge, and we establish your active ownership on the record immediately. The divorce filing complicates things, but doesn't block them if we move quickly." She paused. "Your father's filing is very good, Cole. He was thorough. We have a real case here." Cole said, "How long did he work on this?" Brandt said, "From our first meeting in 2015 until 6 months before he died. He was in my office every quarter. He was very certain you would come home. He just—" She paused again. "He was very private about you. He talked about you often. He never said the things directly that he was building the case to say on your behalf." Cole looked out the window at the dark lake. "Yeah," he said. "I know the type." He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen for a while. Then he got up and went down to the boathouse and stood in the doorway with the lanterns on and looked at the shelving and the false panel and the stack of his father's careful, silent work. Atlas stood beside him. The dog looked at the room and then looked at Cole and then looked at the room again, as if taking a complete inventory of what had been found. Cole said, "Good work, buddy." He said it the way he had said it on the dock in Afghanistan, when Atlas had flagged a pressure plate that 3 men ahead of them had missed. He said it as a precise and earned assessment, not a comfort. Atlas turned and looked up at him with those amber eyes that held the knowledge of things it was not the dog's job to explain. And Cole understood in that moment, standing in his father's sealed room in the late November dark with the lake moving quietly outside, that the sealed boathouse had not been a secret kept against him. It had been a letter that took 30 years to deliver. He had one more thing to do before Portland. He drove to Roy Haskell's house the next morning before the old man was out of bed, and knocked on the door and waited. Roy came to the door in his vest with a coffee mug and looked at Cole with the particular expression of someone prepared for whatever came. Cole said, "I'm going to Portland to see Kate Brandt. I'll be back in 2 days. I need someone to watch the boathouse while I'm gone." Roy said, "2 days." "All right." Cole said, "Nobody goes near it. Nobody who asks questions about it. Nobody who drives slow on the road. Nobody. You call me if anything moves," Roy said. "Understood." Cole said, Thank you for what you did. It wasn't nothing." Roy nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying weight he couldn't put down, and had finally been told he could set it here, on this doorstep, for a moment. Cole drove back to the lake house. Atlas was already in the truck's passenger seat, which was where Atlas always was when Cole was preparing to move, because the dog understood movement the way Cole understood it. Not as departure, but as direction, and direction as purpose, and purpose as the specific opposite of being lost. They left for Portland before noon. The lake road curved through the firs and dropped toward the highway, and Cole drove with both hands on the wheel, and the window cracked, and Atlas with his nose into the moving air. On the seat between them, so in a banker's box that Cole had packed with careful attention, were his father's files. 30 years of a man's uncompleted conversation, finally in transit. Behind them, in the sealed and now repaired boathouse at the end of the dock, the lanterns Cole had left running on their timer threw their steady light against the shelving and the false panel and the remaining letters he had not yet read. The later ones, written in the years when Cole was deployed and unreachable, when his father had been fighting a legal battle alone, and writing to a son he did not know how to reach, and leaving it all in here for the day when the dog would finally lead the way. The lake caught the November light and held it. Some things wait a very long time for the right moment. Some things keep perfectly, when sealed correctly, up against all the weather the world can produce. Catherine Brandt's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Pearl District that looked out over the Willamette River, and she was nothing like Cole had expected, which meant he had been expecting something. She was in her early 60s, small and precise in the way of someone who had learned long ago that economy of movement carried its own authority. She shook Cole's hand, the way men in his experience shook hands, without performance, as a straightforward exchange of information, and she looked at Atlas with immediate and unguarded respect. "He's the one who found the panel," she said. It was not a question. "First night," Cole said. "He knew before I did." She nodded as if this confirmed something she had already believed, so now when she led them into the conference room and closed the door. They worked for 6 hours. Cole laid out the files in the order he had organized them on the drive up, and Brandt moved through them with the focused speed of someone revisiting terrain she knew well. She asked questions that were specific and few. She made notes in a small leather notebook in handwriting that was, Cole noticed, oddly similar in its precision to his father's block print. The handwriting of someone who had learned early that clear communication was a form of respect. On the table between them, Atlas lay on his side and slept with the unguarded completeness of a dog who trusts completely that the humans in the room have the situation managed. By the time they finished, the picture was complete, and the path forward was specific. So Brandt would file a response to Meridian Pacific's water rights challenge within 5 business days, asserting Cole's active ownership and attaching his father's preemptive filing as the foundational document. She would simultaneously file a motion in the divorce proceeding, requesting that the water rights claim be excluded from the marital estate on the grounds that it had been established by Cole's father prior to the marriage and never commingled with marital assets. This was clean and supportable. She had expected to file something like it for years. Cole said, "The law firm Connection, the same firm filed the water rights challenge and processed the divorce." Brandt set down her pen. She looked at him with an expression that was careful and direct in equal measure. "I've been aware of that connection since I was notified of the water rights challenge 8 months ago," she said. I flagged it to the Oregon State Bar. There is an ongoing review." She paused. "I want to be precise with you. I cannot tell you what the review will find. What I can tell you is that the connection is documented and is being examined by people whose job it is to examine it." Cole said, "And Diana?" Brandt said, "I can tell you what the documents show. What they show is that your wife retained that firm approximately 4 months after the water rights challenge was filed by the same firm on behalf of Meridian Pacific. Whether she was aware of the conflict and whether she made decisions based on that connection is something that may or may not be established through the bar review and through the divorce proceeding itself." She looked at him steadily. "I know what you're asking. I'm telling you what I can tell you with the evidence I have." Cole sat with that. It was, he recognized, the right answer. He had spent his career in a world where the facts had to be distinguished from the conclusions drawn from facts, because the conclusions were where missions went wrong and people died. He respected the discipline of it even when it was not what he wanted to hear. He said, "What do you need from me?" She gave him a list. He wrote it down. They shook hands again at the door of the conference room, and as they walked out, Brandt looked at Atlas, who had come awake the moment Cole stood, immediately alert, and said, quietly and without directing it at Cole, "Your father talked about you both. He said the dog would find it first. He was very certain of that." Cole looked at her. He'd never met Atlas. Brandt said, "No, but he knew you. And he said that whatever you needed to find, you'd have the right partner for it." She opened the door to the hallway. He was right. Cole drove back to the lake on a road that wound through the Coast Range and came out above the valley in the late afternoon, when the light was low and orange and the firs cast long shadows across the highway. Atlas had his nose at the window gap. Cole drove with one hand on the wheel, and the quiet that follows a very long period of not knowing finally replaced, at least in part, by the specific gravity of knowing. He had called Roy from the parking garage in Portland before they left. Roy had said nothing had moved at the Boathouse. Roy had said a car he didn't recognize had driven the lake road slowly twice that afternoon. Roy had said he'd written down the plate number. Cole said, "Good man." He stopped at the hardware store on the way through Garrison and bought a second padlock. A better one, a closed shackle model that resisted cutting. And Carol, behind the counter, rang it up and handed him his change and said, without looking up from the register, "People are going to feel pretty foolish." Cole looked at her. She was looking at the register. He said, "They were working with what they had." Carol said, "So were you." He took his change and his lock and went back to the truck, and Atlas was in the passenger seat, watching him with the patient, an amber certainty that had carried them both across 1,200 miles of highway and 30 years of sealed rooms. The response to Meridian Pacific's challenge was filed on a Tuesday. The motion in the divorce proceeding was filed the same day. By Wednesday afternoon, according to Brandt's email, Meridian Pacific's attorney had contacted her office requesting a call, which was, in the language of legal maneuvering, the sound of a position beginning to reconsider itself. By Friday, the plate number Roy had taken had been run through Marcus Webb's contacts and had come back registered to a vehicle leased by a property management company with documented ties to Meridian Pacific. Cole forwarded that information to Brandt without comment. Brandt's reply was 2 sentences. "This goes in the file. Thank you." The legal machinery moved at the speed legal machinery moves, which was not fast by any standard Cole had been trained to operate by, but which was moving in a direction he could now see clearly. Brant was thorough. His father's 30 years of careful preparation had been thorough. The case, as she had told him on the phone before he left Portland, was solid. What changed first was not the legal outcome. That would take months to fully resolve. What changed first was Garrison. It changed the way small places change when the story they have been telling proves to be the wrong one. Not with a public announcement, not with formal acknowledgement, but in the accumulated small adjustments of people who are quietly revising their understanding and finding the revision uncomfortable enough to act on. Roy Haskell came by on a Saturday morning with a box of tools and asked if Cole needed help with the Boathouse dock extension, which Cole had not mentioned to anyone. Cole looked at him. Roy said he had seen the materials stacked near the dock and thought extra hands might be useful. Cole said they might. They spent the morning working side by side in the particular silence of men who don't need to narrate what they're doing. And at noon, Roy sat on the dock boards and looked at the boathouse and said, "Your father would have liked seeing this." Cole set down his hammer. "What was he like when he came to talk to you?" Roy thought about it. "Careful," he said finally. Very careful with his words. Like each one cost him something. He looked at the lake. "But he talked about you more than he talked about anything else, and the work he was doing in there." He nodded toward the boathouse. "He always said it was for you, that it would matter to you when the time came." He paused. "I think he needed someone to know that, even if he couldn't say it to you directly. So he said it to me." Cole picked up his hammer. He drove a nail cleanly into the new board and set it down again and said, "Thank you for holding that." Roy nodded and picked up his own hammer, and they went back to work. Carol at the hardware store stopped looking at the register when Cole came in. Patricia Lund from the county planning office did not come to the parking lot again. The car that had driven the lake road slowly did not come back. And on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Cole had filed the response to Meridian's challenge, a certified letter arrived from the law firm that had processed both the water rights case and the divorce filing, informing Cole that in light of newly arising information and a review of the firm's conflict of interest protocols, they were withdrawing from representation of Diana Mercer in the divorce proceeding and recommending she obtain independent counsel. Cole read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Atlas sat across from him and watched him read it with the patient attention the dog used whenever Cole was processing something that required stillness before response. Cole set the letter down. He looked at Atlas. He looked out the window at the lake, which was doing what the lake always did, holding the light, turning it over slowly, returning it upward in fragments. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the specific, quiet relief of a man who has walked a very long distance in the dark and has finally found solid ground underfoot. It was not the same as arriving somewhere. It was the beginning of being able to see where he was. He picked up his phone and called Brant. She already knew. The withdrawal of counsel triggered court notifications she was copied on. She said the withdrawal complicated Meridian's position as well, given the documented shared representation. She said the bar review had moved to a formal proceeding. She said, "Cole, I think this is going to resolve the way your father intended it to resolve. It's going to take time, but the shape of it is clear." Cole said, "He worked 30 years on it." Brant said, "He was very patient." Cole said, "He was very quiet. There's a difference." There was a pause, and then Brant said, "Yes, I think you're right about that." He ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then he got up and walked down to the boathouse and went inside and sat on the boat cradle in the center of the room with the lanterns on and the dehumidifier running its quiet cycle and the lake making its sound outside the cleaned windows. He picked up the box of unread letters, the later ones, written in the years Cole was deployed and unreachable, and he began to read from where he had left off. His father's handwriting covered the years in the same careful block print. 2004, 2007, 2009, 2012. The legal updates grew more confident as the preemptive filing took shape and the strategy with Brandt developed. But alongside the legal record, running through every letter, the way a river runs beside a road, was the other thing. The accumulated account of a father watching his son's life from a great and self-imposed distance and not knowing how to close it. He wrote about the news coming through when Cole was decorated, without saying how he'd heard, which meant he had been paying attention in ways Cole had never suspected. He wrote about a photograph he'd found of Cole and a teammate at a base somewhere in the Gulf that a mutual contact had forwarded him, and how he had put it on the wall by the boathouse window, and how Atlas, he called the dog Atlas throughout, as if he knew him, which he couldn't have, and which Cole eventually understood, meant his father had been using the name as a placeholder for whatever Cole would need. How Atlas would have approved of the location, because the light was good in the mornings. He wrote, "I don't know how to tell you that I'm proud of you without it sounding like I'm measuring something. So I'll just put it here. In this letter, you may not read for years. I am, completely. For all of it. The parts I know about and the parts I don't, which are probably the more important parts." Cole set that letter down on the boat cradle beside him and did not pick it up again for a while. Atlas had been lying near the door. He got up and came to sit directly in front of Cole and put his head in Cole's lap, and Cole kept his hand on the dog's neck and looked at the shelving and the lantern light and the false panel that was back in place and held 30 years of a man's careful, quiet love in the only form that man had been able to make it. There was no adequate response to that. Cole had learned enough in his life to know when a thing was beyond adequate response and to sit with it anyway, and to let the sitting be enough. Outside, the lake caught the late afternoon light. December now. Cold that was serious but not yet brutal. The kind of cold that clarified rather than obscured. Cole could see through the cleaned windows the far bank's firs standing dark and still, and above them a sky going from blue to the particular amber of a Pacific coast winter evening, and the dock extending out into the water with its new boards pale against the older ones. He stayed in the boathouse until the light was gone. Atlas stayed with him. When he finally walked back up the slope to the house, Roy Haskell was at the property line, finishing something with a fence post. He straightened when he saw Cole coming and looked at him with the expression he used when he was being careful. Not careful against Cole, but careful with him, which was a different thing. Cole stopped at the line. He said, "Brandt thinks the case is going to hold." Roy said, "Good." He looked at his fence post. He looked at Cole. "I knew it would. Your father didn't do things halfway." Cole said, "No." He did them quietly instead. He looked at the lake, visible through the gap in the trees at the bottom of the slope. Turns out those aren't the same thing. Roy looked where Cole was looking. He nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man who has known this for a long time and is glad to have it said aloud by someone who had to learn it the hard way. They stood at the fence line for a moment without speaking, And then Roy said goodnight and went back toward his house, and Cole went back toward his, and Atlas moved between them both in the easy arc of a dog who considers the entire perimeter his responsibility. The legal resolution came in stages over the following months, as legal resolutions always do, not as a single clean moment, but as a series of incremental corrections, each one shifting the weight a little further in a direction that was becoming, by the accumulation of shifts, irreversible. Meridian Pacific's water rights challenge was denied by the county court in February, citing the preemptive filing and the documented continuous ownership chain. The company did not appeal, which Brandt said was as close to an admission as they were likely to get. The bar proceeding concluded in March with findings against the law firm, including censure and mandatory conflict monitoring. The divorce proceeding, with Diana's new independent counsel, moved toward a settlement that excluded the water rights claim entirely, on the basis that Brandt had established. The property was Cole's. The water rights were Cole's. His father's 30 years of careful, silent work had held. In Garrison, the adjustment continued in the way of small places, quietly, without announcement, in the small daily transactions of people who had revised their understanding and were finding it better to simply proceed than to explicitly account for the revision. Carol at the hardware store asked about Atlas by name. Roy Haskell helped Cole rebuild the Boathouse's interior shelving in April. 2 days of work they did mostly in silence, with a radio playing from the dock. And when they were done, Roy stood in the center of the room and looked at the finished shelving and the organized files and the cleaned windows, letting in the spring light, and said, "It looks right now." Cole said, "It does." Roy looked at the false panel, closed and undetectable in the south wall. "You gonna keep the panel?" Cole thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Some things are worth building into the walls." Roy nodded. He looked at Atlas, who was in the doorway in the morning light. "That dog," Roy said. "First night, you said." "First night," Cole said. "He was down here before I finished unpacking." Roy shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the particular quiet appreciation of a man who recognizes something he can't fully explain and doesn't need to. He picked up his tools and went home, and Cole stood in the doorway of the repaired and organized boathouse and looked at the lake and breathed the spring air that was coming up off the water, carrying the smell of pine and distance and something green underneath that was the season beginning to change. Atlas came and stood beside him. The dog looked out at the lake, and then looked at Cole, and then looked back at the lake, and there was nothing complicated in the looking. It was simply where they were, and the dog had always been content with simply where they were. Cole put his hand on Atlas's head. He thought about his father sitting in this room for 30 years, writing letters to a son he didn't know how to reach, building a case that would take that son home. He thought about 30 years of oil in a padlock's keyhole. He thought about a German shepherd who had pressed his nose to a sealed door on the first night and refused to move until Cole paid attention. He thought about what Roy had said in the early days. He always said it was for you, that it would matter to you when the time came. It had mattered, in the specific way that things matter when they arrive not as gifts, but as recognitions of who you are, of what you need, of what has been held in trust for you by people who loved you in the only language they had. He was not finished here. The property needed work, real work, the kind of sustained attention that a place gives back over years if you give it years in return. There were legal matters still running their course, correspondence still to be filed, details still to be resolved. There were letters he had not finished reading. No, there was a future that was not yet built. But the foundation was sound. His father had seen to that, in the careful and silent way his father had seen to everything. Underground, invisible, shaped over decades, holding against all the weather the world could produce. Cole looked at the lake one more time. Then he turned back inside and sat down on the boat cradle in the center of the room and picked up the next letter, the one dated 2012, the one he hadn't read yet. And Atlas lay down at his feet in a rectangle of morning light. And the boathouse was warm and dry and properly sealed against everything that used to get in. And for the first time in a very long time, Cole Mercer was exactly where he was supposed to be. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than I can say. If this story moved you, the videos on your screen right now were chosen because I think you'll feel the same way about them. Go watch one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I'll see you in the next story.